Aloha. Talofalava.
Pulaminaka.
Hapane.
Hello, and welcome to Utopia.
Since 2009, Utopia has worked with queer and trans Pacific Islander leaders to create a safe, welcoming, supportive, and vibrant space for members of our community to address basic needs, build pathways towards new expanding career and life opportunities.
Our mission here at Utopia is to provide sacred spaces to strengthen the minds and bodies of queer and trans Pacific Islanders through community organizing, community care, civic engagement, and cultural stewardship.
Our vision is to create a world of cultural wealth, dignity, healing, and liberation for cutie pies that honors our ancestors and support future generations and ourselves.
One of our values here at Utopia is dignity. We believe in the importance and worth of every person in society. We aim to assist in building that leadership. We believe that everyone is worthy of honor and respect.
Afio Maya. Our doors and arms are always open for you. For more information, you can visit our website at www.utopiawa.org. Thank you, and we hope to see you soon.
Talanoa is a word that is derived from the Samoan culture, which means having a conversation. This word can also be broken into two. Tala means story, and Noa means to tie, which brings us to Talanoa. Utopia Washington has created Talanoa as a platform to provide safe spaces for our queer and trans-Pacific Islanders to have a conversation, share their stories, and for community members to make a connection. While Talanoa is usually hosted in person, due to the pandemic, Utopia Washington has been able to utilize digital platforms to bring you Talanoa virtually. We are glad to have you here with us today. Welcome to our Talanoa.
Talofalava and good evening. Thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Tweety Fatuesi. I use she, her pronouns, and I serve as the Civic Engagement Program Manager with Utopia Washington.
And good evening. My name is Suilan Hukanu, pronoun friendly, serving also as the Civic Engagement Program Manager at Utopia Washington. Welcome to our Talanoa. This isn't a breakup, it's a wake up. How disaggregating more than just data empowers our NHPI communities. So to kick us off, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. This wording is reused from the duwamishtribe.org website. It is important to note that this kind of land acknowledgement is not a new practice developed by colonial institutions. Land acknowledgement is a traditional custom dating back centuries for many Native communities and nations. For non-Indigenous communities, land acknowledgement is a powerful way of showing respect and honoring the Indigenous peoples of the land on which we work and live. Acknowledgement is a simple way of resisting the erasure of Indigenous histories and working towards honoring and inviting the truth. With that, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the first people of Kent, the Muckleshoot people past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the Muckleshoot tribes.
At this time, we would like to introduce our wonderful panelists for this evening. It is my honor, privilege, and joy to introduce to you our first guest for tonight. Tawai Samwelu is the daughter of a pastor from Leulumuenga and a nurse from Samoa in Samoa. As the executive director for Empowering Pacific Islander Communities, also known as EPIC, she's a passionate advocate for Pacific Islanders and is committed to liberation for all. Tawai was born and raised on Tonga territory and credits her time on unceded Ohlone land for her political consciousness. Before joining EPIC, Tawai served as the development director for the Rise Youth Center. Enrichment, and has since become a member of RISE's board of directors. In addition to that, she serves as the vice president for the AAPI Equity Alliance Board, a member of the NCAPA Executive Committee, and most recently joined the California 100 as a commissioner. During the pandemic, she has learned that her most important title is anti-vi. Please give me a warm welcome for Tavai Samuelu. Welcome, Tavai. Please feel free. I know that was a very wonderful bio, but I want you to please feel free to add on to that in case I missed anything else.
And any access needs as well.
Yes, thank you.
Nothing to add. Thank you for being so gracious to read the whole thing. I think I made just that my pronouns are she, her, and then I'm joining you all from what's presently known as Long Beach, where the original stewards are the Tongva people. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tabai. Next, we have Suilan Hukanu. Suilan has over 30 years as a servant leader in Indigenous education communities. Suilan's current journey is as the Cultural Program Director for the Enum Claw School District and works collectively with the Muckleshoot Nation, local Indigenous and Aboriginal communities nationally and globally on environmental, educational, policy, and pedagogy in reestablishing the value in Indigenous knowledge, pathways, and the value that they hold.
Suilan continues to share her experiences and believes by sharing the true meaning of aloha and standing firmly in the present with our backs to the future, our eyes upon our past, we will be able to access the deep and abundant ike of our kapuna. It is through our kapuna and our wisdom that we continue to grow, cultivate, and elevate, as well as expanding our ike for the benefit of Haumana, Ohana, and Kaiaulu, as well as ultimately honoring our Honua communities. Welcome, Suilan. How are you this evening?
Oh, mahalo nui loa. Mai ka'ino. Thank you. Doing well. Mahalo for that wonderful introduction and just your graciousness. Honored to be in space with all of you today. So, mahalo I kapoe, kama'aina. I am currently residing on the lands of the Muckleshoot territory, and it is where I continue to work and live and share community, Kaiaulu. So it's really wonderful to just share this space and this opportunity to talk story with you all to Talanoa. So mahalo nui loa.
Thank you for being here. Thank you. And then finally, we have Stella Wayman. Stella Wayman is the Strategic Advisor of Health Services and Construction for the City of Seattle Office of Economic Development, a Tongan-born woman who strives to change policies and systems to be racially equitable, inclusive for Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. Her goal is to ensure these communities have economic and workforce opportunities to build generational wealth, be healthy, and thrive. Please help us welcome Stella. Hi, Stella. How are you?
Malolele, welcome. Thank you for having me. I'm feel very privileged to be part of this panel and to discuss disaggregating data for Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. So thank you for welcoming me in this space.
Thank you for being here. We appreciate you all taking the time to join us this evening. So I came up with an icebreaker question to sort of help lighten the mood before we dive deeper into discussion. And the icebreaker that I've selected for this evening is, what is a food item that you disliked as a child but ended up loving as an adult? I can go first. I can model, and I will pass it over popcorn style. To answer this question, I think for me, what food item I really disliked as a child was vegetables. I really loved fruits, but somehow as I grew older, the tables have turned. And so I now have I love vegetables so much more than fruits. And I think that I can only tolerate it if it was like in the form of a drink. So it's weird how taste buds sort of just grow as you get older, but that's my take on that question. And I will pass it over to Stella.
All right, thank you. Yeah, this is probably going to be a shocker to folks, but rice.
Rice?
Did not like rice when I was younger. I despise rice. Like if there was rice, I was looking for, kumala or something. Like I did not like rice. And then I discovered teriyaki, and then it was like, hey, rice. Everything is rice.
Combo.
But I loved our native starches, and that's what I ate. But now, yeah, I have an appreciation for rice. It's like you have to eat rice with everything, even spaghetti.
You want to popcorn it, Stella?
Oh yeah. Let's go, Suilan.
Oh, mine was squid, right? So when I was little, because my father is a fisherman, he would get the hair and he would take the squid and he would like dive and then he would the ink bag and spit it out, and chop it up right there while it's still like moving, and then he would like make us eat it right there, like fresh out the ocean, right? And I was always like, and so I just couldn't do the he'e with my dad, just the way he presented it, real Hawaiian, real Kanaka. But now, oh my gosh, it's one of my favorites. Okay, especially if it's like kimchi, right? Or in some kind of luau, squid luau or something, right? And so yeah, it was he'e. It was the way it was presented as a kid. You're watching this live he'e come out with your dad, and then he's just like, So now I do appreciate it. So I do appreciate it. So that was my story. Tavai.
Thank you. No, I love hearing that. I'm like, I want your dad to be on my zombie apocalypse team. I just need more people who know how to do things. I have a lot of like people who can, philosophize. I was like, I need some like hunter gatherers. No, as a kid, I was a weird kid. I was very like discriminating. I didn't really eat anything, so it was like everything. And then now as an adult, I should probably discriminate more because I'm allergic to a lot of things. I'm like, no. And now that I think about it, it's sort of this thing of I was the first person in my family born here in the US. So I've built up zero like immunities to any. I'm just allergic to everything. And my mom's like, how did this happen? I was like, you gave me no genetic disposition to anything. So no, but I feel like that's the thing as an adult. I'm just realizing how my system just cannot handle all of like dairy is my great unrequited love. So yeah. But yes, check. Or actually, Suilan, you haven't gone yet.
Yeah, the one that I was thinking of was the papaya fruit. So I grew up, my mom would make papaya when I was a kid, and I just like thought it just like smelled like vomit. and I just could not appreciate it. But now it's by far one of my favorite fruits. It is so delicious. I wonder if it's an acquired taste for people, but yeah, I just remember growing up like, why would anyone eat this? It's an amazing fruit. I love papaya.
All this talk of food is making me hungry.
It was a great start.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing. Really interesting choices as far as how what we enjoy as children and then what we now enjoy as adults. It's enlightening to see that.
Yes, I hope people had something to eat because we're going to be diving in and using our brains. So before we begin our conversation, I actually want to just give a little bit of like historical background, just for our audience and for our guests here, a little bit about the history of the term AAPI and why Pacific Islanders and Asian Americans were lumped together in the first place. So to understand the history of the term AAPI, we must first understand the history of the term Asian American. The term Asian American was actually a radical term. It was first used by UC Berkeley student activists Emma G. and Yuji Ichioka in 1968. Asian American was used to unite different communities of Asian descent in order to create a more formidable protest bloc, an approach actually inspired by the Black Power movement. So Asian Americans were actually united in a shared history of exclusion and immigration bans and racism. In the 80s and 90s, the classification broadened even further via the term Asian American and Pacific Islander, or AAPI, a decision that is obviously proven controversial as we're talking about today.
And so at that time, Pacific Islanders were too small of a group in the mind of key decision makers to report separately. The presence of Asian Americans in Hawaii may have been one of the reasons that the two initially were put together. And so in 97, the government disaggregated Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders in its data through the vestiges of this umbrella, which is now AANHPI, a category that remains and includes organizations, coalitions, and event titles. Many other organizations are now starting to adopt the term AANHPI when you really consider the specific dedication to the AANHPI community this month, as it's dedicated to our respective communities, as well as like the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, Asian Pacific Islander Coalition. The list goes on and on, but those are just some of the few examples that we wanted to share with you all.
So with that background, kind of lingering and mingling in our minds, I'd love to start with Tavai on our first question, which is, why is data disaggregation important to you personally and the work that you do? And also disaggregation in general in terms of Asians and Pacific Islanders.
Sure. The reality of data disaggregation is that it's actually waiting for data to catch up to the ways that our communities already organize themselves in very disaggregated and separate manners. I grew up my entire life being Samoan, and then I didn't become API until I went to college. And even then, it was a constant site of erasure, of having to fight to remind people I'm here. And thinking about that, then even the data disaggregation work that I started doing was as a student organizer at UC Berkeley, and this Count Me In campaign in 2009 that pushed UC-wide for them to start disaggregating our data so that we could actually see what was happening to our students. As so often we were told as Pacific Islanders, you are overrepresented. We know that didn't match our reality. And I think, when I hear the stories of OMB 15 and the work that was done in 1997, to understand that this is part of a long legacy, and that it asks this question of what's the purpose of data, right? That it's most neutral. We hope that data helps us to measure the severity of a problem and the efficacy of a solution. And our current data setup doesn't actually do that. And so I recognize the limitations of data, and that data in the hands of white supremacy will still do white supremacist things. And that what we understand it to be is data disaggregation is an effort to actually sharpen what is now a tool that's ineffective for our communities.
Yeah.
Have you checked in with UC Berkeley to see how the culture has changed there? Do you know if it's improved? Or if they've taken, strides now to make sure that our community there is represented well?
I think they're still fighting, that the students still face a lot of frustration and issues. I will say there's a lot of significant improvement since I was there as a student. And even when I was there as a student, it was inheriting a long legacy before me of folks who had really established certain things, right? Like I was able to take a Pacific Islander Studies class. I learned Samoan American history through then Dr. Vika Paleta, which I think many of you know. Now, shout out to Angel Halafihi. She's an alumni of our pilot program at EPIC. She's the program coordinator for the CalPI initiative. There's now an entire initiative that's dedicated to making sure that they're retaining and recruiting our students, though we know it's not sufficient. So has it improved? Yeah, and it could still always get better.
It's amazing to see the connections between UC Berkeley in '68 and you there, and just like how that work is still being done, and yeah, it's quite inspiring. I'd love to hear from Suilan or Stella about this question, how data disaggregation is important to you personally and the work that you do. Maybe we can go to Suilan.
Yeah, I think, well, first, being, an economically land displaced Kanaka, right? Here in Washington, in the diaspora, I think that, if we had the opportunity to be home, I would be home. But because of, economic challenges and, the things that we are facing as Pacific Islanders, most of us would choose to be home if we could be home. But economics, like that's a huge thing for us. And so for me, I'm going to say that, my why is really directly related to my personal and my professional and my educational experience, why it's so important that we look at the impacts to our kaiāulu, right, our communities in education, economics, health, environmental, and land, and the list can go on and on. But I think we need to have the disaggregated data in order to have the proper voices to create the support systems, and to recognize the needs of our communities, and who better but to recognize the needs of our communities, but those of us from our communities, and then look at how I'm a dissector by nature, so policy really is my place of power, where I love to get in there and looking at the policies that have been developed for us but not by us, right? And when we disaggregate data, we're able to have a voice at the table to see where those fundings are going to see the support services or the lack of support services. And so in my own educational journey, there were no support services for, our Pacific Islanders, even in Hawaii, right? Because we were not even being, our data even in there being clumped in the AAPI, AHPI, right? All of that still was not properly representing what our communities, truly the numbers of our communities, the needs of our communities. And when I think it's important, when we look at our Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders, also to begin to unveil the similarities of the disparities of our communities of color, right? But we need to be able to have current voice in legislature, and in the policy decision-making spaces. And when it comes to education, that's another whole conversation we can get into, because we know that our students are not receiving the necessary supports to maintain themselves in this educational system, nor are they receiving the cultural, educational, I don't want to just say just support, but culturally relevant learning and teaching that is necessary in our school systems. And so, we're still invisible in these spaces, right? But more importantly, I think we really need to be able to be driving where funding is going to in that retention and the recruitment, in our K through 12 and also in our colleges. And I personally know that I did not receive the necessary support going through my undergraduates and my graduate degrees. And then that underreporting is still something we're still facing in education even today. So I'll stop at that.
Yeah, no, thank you for naming that, the way that the lack of that disaggregated data actually has affected you personally, in the lack of services and support that you were able to receive as you went through schools.
Yeah, and I just want to say one other thing is, for most of us here on this Talanoa today, English is not our first language. It's our first forced language. So let's get that straight, right? It's our first forced language. And because of that, we still struggle with the way that academia has assessed our learning growth. While we are assets, we were always looked at, we were the problem. It was never us that was the problem. It was the system that didn't value the cultures and the communities and our first languages from where we came from.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I do want to. I'm a bit curious. In like what to hear what you might recommend or suggest for folks to be, more politically active in policy changes. Through my work with Utopia Washington, specifically with the Civic Engagement Department, there have been challenges trying to get community to really activate their political stance, to create an environment in Washington State that can bring about meaningful lives, for our community members here. First and foremost, language is a very difficult barrier for folks to sort of like overcome. And then when you get into the lingo of political of politics, it makes it even that much more confusing.
Mhm.
So, like, for us to sort of go forth into community and try to engage folks to register to vote or be politically aware about laws that are affecting communities of color. I've noticed that yes, there is interest, but then the movement to sort of drive people to act on certain policies that work against us, can be a difficult thing to make happen. So yeah, I'm just curious what you might be able to suggest as far as like getting folks more involved.
Yeah, and I think we have to point out that policies were made by white supremacy, right? They were made through an institution that was really purposefully leaving communities of color out. So, you look at the Senate, look at Congress, look at who's historically held positions as a president, right? They were white males, right? We had Obama in there now. So when we think about historically, these policies and just the political realm it wasn't made with us intended to be in there. We had to relearn another language, which was English, but then we had to relearn another language, which is the politics and policies. And it's just like paddling a canoe. This is what I'm going to use our metaphors, because we all ocean people, right? You first get into your va'a, you may not know how to paddle if you're not from a paddling ohana, right? A hui va'a. But once you get in there and you start practicing, then you get familiar with what you're supposed to be doing. And it really is us having to relearn a new language and a new way, but understanding that it's really important for us to navigate that so that we can have a place at the table and then begin to disrupt what historically that was not made for us, and then begin to craft and recreate what can then now service our communities. But it is hard, that the reasons those policies was made was to keep us at, a certain space. But we are now entering into those places where we've relearned their language. We become ma'a, we become familiar to that. So, yeah.
Suilan, we want to recruit you to inspire our communities. I love the analogies that you're using and the connections you're making. I think we got to do more of that, and the storytelling too.
Stories.
Thank you.
Stella, we'd love to hear from you about this question. Why is disaggregation, whether it's data or not, important to you personally and the work that you do?
Just going back on what everyone else is saying, it's being able to tell the story, being aggregated with the Asian American. Even when you look at educational attainment, employment, and wage wealth, like, we seem higher because of the Asian American. They have a higher rate of attaining, bachelor degrees or more compared to Pacific Islanders that were stood alone. So if you stand them alone, you can actually see that we, mimic more of our, Black African Americans, which, is at a very high rate of low wage earning employment, as well as, education. What is it, right? And so being able to have that kind of data and being able to show those percentages, because again, when you talk about the language that we must speak with them, that's what we have to do. We have to, map it out and show a graph to say, this is where we stand. We can't do that. We cannot do that right now. There's very far and in between that can be done. But it's not in a place to disrupt systems. The government is still behind. The educational system is still behind. They're still operating on a 40+ year system that is not caught up to the 21st century. So when we're thinking about economic wealth and closing that gap, as well as educational attainment, you can only change policies and systems when you speak that language. And so I wholeheartedly agree with all of y'all with talking about we changing our language, and then kind of mobilizing that to our communities. How do we do that? Because there's also times where we are at war with ourselves. We have those that say, well, you are all the educated ones, why don't you do something? Not understanding that community means all efforts, all levels of folks mobilizing on this. But we have to teach them that language. If they are going to say we are the educated one, then we must educate. And I believe that's one of the biggest issues that I found, especially within my community. It's one of those things was like, well, how do we speak both languages to ensure that we have everyone on common ground to come to the table and be able to do what everyone else does, right? Signatures, this, that, but then we're also in a place where immigration status is an issue for our folks, right? So how does the undocumented be part of this mobilization if it takes many of us to come together to sign a bill, many of us to support a bill, so I think about those things, and I think about how we're always lumped in and look kind of good, kind of, right? Because again, that Asian American puts us there, but it's not true. And we know that. That's why we're having this Talanoa.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'd love to go on to the second question, definitely related to a lot of what we're speaking about, but I'd love to maybe dive into a little bit more of the specifics on how the lack of disaggregation has showed up in your work or has impacted your work or has just affected the way that you move about in this work. And so maybe we could bring it to Tavai.
Sure. There's something I want to kind of complicate here and add. I agree with a lot of the points that have been made, and I also want to add that the lack of disaggregation harms Asian Americans as well, right? That even Asian American is quite monolithic in the way that it's treated, and that we also find ourselves oftentimes, our trajectory is comparable to that of the Southeast Asian community. That we actually find them often as, and when I say we, I mean I find them often as our closest accomplices in the things that we push for around having pro-Indigenous immigration stances, around fighting deportation, around breaking the school to prison to deportation pipeline, as they often even thinking about wage gaps, and the greatest wealth gaps actually exist just within the Asian American community. Right, when we look at data around wealth gaps and for really pay gaps even for Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander women, in 2018 it showed that the highest wealth gap or wage gap was actually for Bhutanese and Marshallese women who are making 50 cents on the dollar of every dollar a white man was making, right? And so I think there's this part of it where I want to complicate our conversations around, it's not just data that's insufficient, it's all of these categories as well that don't actually match the ways that we talk about each other and talk about our relationship to power. And ultimately that being the thing that feels the least congruent, right? And when we have this aggregation, when they talk about, right, we don't have the same relationship to power, access to resources, ways in which to navigate systems. So in thinking about the ways that impacts how I can do the work that I do, the challenges that I face, it's from top to bottom, and it also is a defining factor of EPIC when it was first founded in 2009, knowing that was something that is taken up. But I also want to acknowledge that there are folks who've been fighting aggregation since we were aggregated, folks who were very clear in their stance, and want to acknowledge, the folks like Senator Akaka and Auntie Esther Kiana, and even before Senator Akaka, folks from American Samoa who were saying that's not right, that doesn't match. And the other aspect of data suppression that makes even looking at our communities complicated and complex is that we're a majority mixed race community. And naming how many of our folks are literally API and where they find themselves like holding that tension or moving through this space. And so I think where I find myself more recently, and I think this is always a sharper pain point during this month, where instead of seeing ourselves erased once a month, it's like every day. Every day we're seeing something that's called API or API Heritage Month or whatever the case. And part of that is acknowledging, right, as a people of genealogy of Ngafa, that the origins matter. And so we know that the origins of this month didn't actually include our people. And so we find ourselves fighting to try to carve out a space for ourselves in a thing that was never intended for us. And so what does it mean to try to do something else? And I'd say as like a closing point, like the aggregation that we're pushing, like where the disaggregation that we're pushing for more recently is around the disaggregation of resources. How we're pushing like API organizations to be honest about who and how they serve, who they're in relationship to, and how we're pushing philanthropy to disaggregate the resources that they've committed. To be very clear that if they said that they were going to fund the API community, that I need them to measure whether those dollars actually got to the PI community.
Yeah.
And that is why I say that, we are at war with ourselves because of the fact that, this is my own personal opinion, is as a Pacific Islander, we do not like to leave anyone behind, and so we constantly think about, the A and the PI. But in order for, funding and, any kind of support to come to PI so that, because when you measure it, it's very tiny, and I say that because even in my own department at the city, Utopia is the first PI, organization that they have funded, the first in the existence of this, so those are the things that I say that, I fight for that separation because it has to happen, because otherwise, all we're showing is the Asian part of funding and sources and resources and support. I mean, it's crazy, right? And so that's why for me, sitting here going, wow, this is crazy. Like, this is the first time, because it took a PI to come sit in that seat to do that, right? Because they're reaching out to the community saying, no, they exist. There are folks out there. There are grassroots that we can support and provide from a government system, but I agree with you, Tavai. It's a system disruption, Suilan. It has to happen in that way, but we're fighting a very old system that does not intend for any seats for us to take, and we have to just take it.
And I think too, to just, to align with the conversation, is we are fighting a very old system, and then we are also having to re-inform our own old systems, right? And I think that's what you mean by fighting our own. And that's a very difficult conversation to have, because our elders, some, and our communities have become comfortable in some of those erasure spaces. And we've also been shamed into just being quiet, right? And not creating too much hakaka, as you would say, right? To become complacent and accept the add-ons, as you both said, right? It wasn't made for us, but now we're checked in there. Okay, let's just jump in that. And be okay with that. And we can't be okay with that. There's a policy out right now, and I'm just going to use this as an example. And it's been out for quite some time in education for migrant farmer children. And the migrant farmer children, because they are they move around a lot. There are certain policies in education, because the children have to go with their families during different seasons for crop times. So we make allowances for education to help navigate that for these families. And that's a wonderful thing. It's a great policy. It's a policy that was necessary to support the families that are feeding this nation, right? Because they're the ones harvesting the foods and feeding this nation. But more recently, and I did have a conversation with OSPI about it, more recently, Native communities were now attached to it. So we become another accessory to a policy that was not initiated for us in the first place. And I think when we begin to have those kind of conversations, like this was an existing policy, but let's just throw you in there, then that's where it becomes problematic, right? We don't need to be an accessory to an already existing policy. We need to create one that was made for our people and for, what services us. Otherwise, what happens is it assumes this homogeny, right? Like as if things are similar, when we should be celebrating sometimes our differences and what those needs are in each community. And the underlying differences that we have to address for each community. And I'm going to use, some of our environmentally displaced Pacificas, right? We need to understand that the United States of America, and, this is where some of our, we get some contentious feedback, has done some harm by using our islands as targets, right? And creating radiation where we can no longer even go sit under our ancestral coconut trees because we can't even return back to those islands. So now we're being displaced or forced to move into the continent of the United States. What does that look like? And then how do we create a place for that understanding? So when we talk about trauma, we can't just put you into another category or drop you in as an accessory. We must look at that particular community's need and even the trauma that comes attached to that, right? Because then we forget that there is trauma attached to that. And then we just begin to lump them in together as if this is going to solve the problem. And we can't do that anymore. We just can't do that anymore.
And you said made for these communities, but I also want to put it, and also made by these communities too, right? And that's something we will talk about later, is like, what do we do to ensure that these policies have our voices at the table, have lived experiences written into it? Tweety, do you want to ask the next question?
Yeah, sure. I guess I'd like to direct this next one to Stella, specifically around building more equity with PI communities or PI members in the work that you do. What would you say to legislators or policymakers or those who are sitting at the decision-making tables who still continue to group Pacific Islanders with Asians, but not just these two specific communities, but I'm sure you might be experiencing it with other community groups as well. What are some differences between the groups that they should be aware of and need to know?
Yeah, with this question, it's a heavy one, but basically what I would let them know is, without having the proper information to inform and be educated on the needs of the Pacific Islander group and those and others that are experiencing, barrier to services, or not even, or the lack thereof, they must have a white paper that states these type of things, and so for me, it would be to say to them that, this has to happen in order for policies and legislation to take, be able to see it for themselves exactly what this looks like, and how it affects the communities. And so that would be one of the many things I would say. Also, just really looking at when they put out these reports and they show all these different, data graphs that talks about, who is where. They're always lumping up, Asian or Pacific Islander. So which is it? What is the percentage saying? Is it the Asian or is it the Pacific Islander? Because that doesn't speak any volume into the needs that, the folks are experiencing in the community. So that's one of the things that I would, really hark on for the policymakers Even myself, that's one of the things that I have to think about when I'm looking at changing policy. It's like, am I too having the same lens, or am I looking at this for what they need and not ours? Just because I want it to pass, again, it's that whole like just to push it through, get somewhere, but that doesn't get us anywhere. Again, it's more harm than not.
Tavai, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, we invited some electeds to this Talanoa, and what would you say to them to in their idea of like why these groups are still grouped together, and the need to separate them, and yeah.
Sure. And these are Washington State electeds?
Yes. We invited some here locally. Hopefully some in the state of California are probably tuning in as well.
I asked for the clarification because I do want to acknowledge that as someone who finds themselves in, what's called California, whatever imaginary that is likely disrespectful to the first people of this fake state. But I acknowledge my own positionality to say that I'm in deference to those who are here, who are actually in Washington, that you are the ones that these policymakers should be listening to. The perspective that I can offer is as someone who's done this work across the country, and we do a lot of policy work in Sacramento and DC, and what we find ourselves with, it's interesting because when EPIC first started, right, our elders had been telling stories about their suffering for decades. Right? They told them about heart disease. They told them about cancer. They told them about diabetes, all of these things that were devastating our communities. And it was always this, what are your numbers? What are your data? Right? And so it's the chicken or the egg of like, we need you to give us numbers in order to prove how much you're suffering. And until you have those numbers, we can't help you with your suffering. And so ultimately, I need many policymakers, actually, the reality should probably just step aside for our communities and make space. The other critical part is to believe our communities when we say it the first time.
Yeah.
When we tell you we're suffering the first time, to not put already oppressed communities in a position where they have to do even more work to demonstrate their suffering, right? And that the situation we find ourselves in around the pandemic, around the disproportionate rates of COVID, we're in an inevitability of long-standing inequity and long-standing underinvestment in our communities. As Stella said, right, that for Utopia to be the first group, given what the Pacific Islander population looks like in Washington and how much organizing has gone on, is a demonstration of like just how short these things are falling. And so what is the speed at which, right? And I think that's the other part that gets frustrating around policy for our communities, right? It's not instant gratification. These things are very long and slow, very long and slow moving, and often incremental. And so knowing that what dictates the pace of how we move as community advocates and servant leaders is the needs of our community and the trust that they've placed in us. And so to see that we ask them to engage in systems that we know were designed sometimes to kill them, to not support their survival. And then also having our communities, we tell them time and time again, this won't change without you. And so how are policymakers making this a sustainable process for our communities and making sure the pace at which you move is dictated by the trust our communities have placed, right? And by the needs of our community, by the urgency that we're always moving with.
Thank you so much for speaking on that. Especially with the pandemic that's gone on, a lot of our community members really did take a hard hit, and that was really truth-telling to see the lack of resources that are allocated to us as a people, as it relates to government funding, to philanthropy, those with money, with generational wealth that have all of the resources to support themselves, and then harboring those resources in a way that shifts the balance to make it so that communities of color are still oppressed when trying to access resources around any type of health support, any type of, or even for the LGBTQ community, as it relates to mental health and wellness, and food sovereignty, food inequity, all those types of uh, uh, like pieces that was really revealing specifically during COVID, which um, we had to sort of make the shift to drive data collection as much as possible so that we could get into qualifications for additional support from those with money, which I feel like shouldn't be the case, because at that point it would be too late for the community members who need it most, specifically in the time when it is needed with a sense of urgency. But yeah, I think that you bringing that up just took me back to all of that, and so I appreciate you for calling that out.
It makes me think about disaggregation also happening specifically, for example, in the Pacifica community, in the Samoan community, for example. Like, how about the LGBTQ Samoan community? And how about the undocumented community? And like, what specific resources do these disaggregated communities need as well? And I really that's the equity piece that I really urge policymakers to look at as well. Suilan, do you have any thoughts before we go into our intermission?
Yeah, I think, I just want to just feed within that and weave, with it, into that conversation is, when, especially when COVID hit, right? What were some of the resources that we didn't receive because we weren't counted, because we were invisible? What were some of the health disparities and the misunderstanding of our community needs within that, and even when, some of the money that was being distributed for small businesses, our people weren't even aware of what to do with that, to how to even apply for all those millions of dollars that were given out for small businesses. I can tell you, maybe if we had even 1% of our Pacifica that got any of those federal funds for their small businesses to economically hold them through, some of those challenges, and there's just, we're going to go on a break pretty soon, and I think we'll dialogue a little bit more, but it really just shows how we weren't counted within that. And the food disparities, let's not get started on, we have specific food needs, right? And those are traditional ways of our sovereign foods. But we know when food is being distributed, sometimes, most times, I'm not even going to say sometimes, it's the most unhealthiest food that's being given out to our communities, right? And that is not something that's going to help our health disparities. It's only going to enhance the health disparities that our communities face. But we don't even have a say within that. But really looking at how we weren't counted in the distribution of COVID relief. And we had to work really hard, as Tavai said, right, to almost beg and plead to get the proper support that we needed for our families and our communities, to be able to just make it through. And so, I'm going to leave it at that, because I know we're right about at time. But I just want to say, we cannot continue to navigate that way. COVID had, I always say, it just, it served everyone else on their tables, what we've been having to digest for a very long time.
Stella, any final thoughts from you?
No, Tavai and Suilan, you both said it very well. I mean, all I can do is agree and appreciate, what you bring to the table. So yeah, thank you.
Excellent. With that, I'd love to go into our intermission and give us a little bit of maybe a sensory break. I'd like to welcome Rowdy. Rowdy Aguero Ablao is a multidisciplinary artist and cultural educator from the island of Guahan. Their work explores themes of home, family, and ancestry using sculpture, fashion, and performance as places for ritual, remembrance, and celebration. They like cats, thrift shopping, and social justice. Please welcome and send stars for Rowdy.
Welcome, Rowdy.
Hi. Hi, hello. Nice to meet everyone again on this Zoom. Thank you, everyone, for your wise words earlier. I've been just nodding the whole time. As I was listening, I feel like I have whiplash or something. I need to massage my neck. But much great wisdom to all of you. But yeah, I'm here to do a little sensory break. I'm going to actually offer up a story and a chant. In light of a lot of the events happening in this world, there's a lot of grief that we're all holding, and sometimes you don't have time to pause or to just take a moment to be with each other. So I wanted to offer this one small story by one of my favorite Palawan and Chamorro writers, Siobhan McManus, and end with a chant to those who are here with us, those who are not, and those who will be here with us later. So thank you. So this is from an anthology featuring Pacifica writers called Insights from Oceania. So you want to just take a little break, rest into your body, take a breath, drink that tea. I'm just going to take a little story and take a little break. So, this is called One Sunday. December 15, 2002. Ponksana is what the radio man called her this morning. The worst typhoon our island has seen in decades. I know that because we missed church today. We haven't missed church in 7 years. Mom made sure we still sang worship songs in our living room. Most of the big schools have been turned into shelters. I almost forgot it was Christmas break. I wonder if this means more vacation days. The power and water in our neighborhood hasn't come back yet. There's a fallen telephone pole blocking the roads near my house. But Dad said we'll get a generator soon. You think the worst part of a typhoon is the rain that pelts your skin like needles, or the menacing ocean that swallows the roads with each wave, or the thunder that shakes you from your sleep. But those things pass. Instead, it's the stench of stagnant water in your muddy backyard, the uprooted ironwood trees, or grandma's shaking knees, the shards of window glass wedged in molding carpet, waiting to cut my feet. Our house hasn't felt the wind in days. Ponksana came and took everything with her, even the breeze. The night air sits heavy on our lungs. We suffocate by candlelight in forced stillness. The sun has long set, but Grandma is still outside, mourning her fallen banana trees. She walks through the littered taro patch, murmuring old words that only her plants understand. Her head is permanently bent towards the soil, checking for a pulse. She sits under the moon on a plastic folding chair until it's too dark for me to see her silhouette from inside. Night falls. My family sleeps as our house begins to rot with us. I'm kept awake by the incessant hum of mosquitoes sucking on our storm-torn bodies. Isla curled up on the futon couch in my brother's room. My feet dangle off the bed's edge, where shadows cast by a flickering candle threaten to eat me. If I close my eyes, I fear the sun will not come up. So I listen for the rise and fall of my brother's chest in the quiet distance. My sisters are asleep in the smaller room next door, and I can hear their breathing too. Up and down I follow their rhythms, like crests and troughs of a quiet ocean. Outside, the black sky shows indigo hints of dawn. In flooded creeks, beneath buried fish bones, Grandma's taro roots plunge further into the darkness, taking me with them. Listen, Rungalek, I hear them call. They are searching for the same thing we are, and they will find it. Ancient undead rhythms, a faint pulse, new beginnings, life reborn. Ineni hamzu manayaina mami. Ineni hamzu manayaluna mami. Ineni iman mofonagwihan. Ineni iman mofonagwihan. Ineni hamzu manayaina mami. Ineni hamzu manayaluna mami. Ineni iman mofonagwihan. Ineni iman mofonagwihan. Sanmaas, everyone. Sending lots of love and prayers to everyone and blessings in the world, wherever you're at. Thank you.
Rowdy, thank you. I feel grounded, and I also feel like I was taken back to another time. So thank you for that, Rowdy.
Thanks again. And at this time, we're going to continue on with the rest of our Talanoa. But before we do, I do want to encourage our 15,000 viewers out there to please feel free to submit a question if you're interested on engaging into our conversation. Feel free to direct it towards any one of our panelists, but also to our those of us here facilitating as well. We really want this to be like a engaging conversation, not just between us, but for those of you at home watching or wherever it is that you're tuning in from. And with that, I would like to pick up our program again by directing this next question to Tavai. What are some authentic ways in which Asians and Pacifica can build true solidarity with each other? What are some ways the Asian American community can practice equity with the Pacifica community in your line of work?
Yeah. Well, first I want to thank Rowdy for, I think there's something so kind about blessing people in that way, and also to you all for creating this kind of space. I think you just taught me something about what it means to implement care and integrate it all of the time and not just at fixed points. Yeah, I just feel really held, so thank you. I think this question is a critical one. It's also one that I can't be super prescriptive about for everyone. I think what I've learned so much, all the relationships I build with anyone are really driven by our cultural values. I think about, for someone, it's Tosiva or Teoleva, right? How we take care of the sacred space that connects us. And that's something that I teach to folks, whether they're someone or not, about like, listen, when I'm doing this, when I'm holding you accountable, when I'm being difficult, when I'm trying to talk to you about conflict, it's because I'm trying to take care of the space that connects us, right? And then this also piece, I've learned from from kupuna, like someone I affectionately call kumu Kevin, around what it means to actually get to pono, like all of the hard work it takes to actually be in right relationship to each other. So I usually am very explicit with partners that we have, Asian individual leaders or Asian organizations, or that are usually like API in name only. Really calling them in, asking critical questions of who's on your board, who's on your staff, who do you serve, who are you in relationship to, and how much that gets to drive the accountability and also this value, and being clear with them, like, we're not pono right now. We can't be. I want to be in right relationship with you, and it's going to take some work. It's going to take some consistently showing up with each other. And then the last piece I'll say is usually what I have to remind folks of, right, where what happens frequently in these conversations, these accountability conversations that I'll have with Asian American leaders and organizations, is this: we didn't know, right? Or they, as like for myself, it'll be the third conversation I've had that week, and for them it'll be the very first one. And so thinking about how we enter it, or how I enter it specifically, of like, I have had to build this muscle around API things for almost 20 years now. You are brand new, but I am not. I have had to take care of this wound for a really long time. And I can offer you all of the grace in the world. And at some point, there's a boundary that needs to be held. And there's a responsibility that needs to be taken in relationships where there's a disparity in power and privilege. And so wanting to make sure that people understand that when we're coming to meet each other and making decisions that, you know, this category will say that empire is the way that we met each other, but our cosmologies don't say that. Our own like stories say that we've met each other time and time again in better conditions, in ways that were dictated by a desire to take care of each other. And so to be clear to folks, like, I don't want to share empire with you. Don't invite me to empire. I want to share liberation. And are you ready to get there?
Oh my gosh. Just drop the mic. Woo! Yes. I love that. Change, like the shifting the context of, like, instead of thinking of solidarity and equity in white supremacist, imperialist, capitalist patriarchy, right, in the context of liberation and ecosystems of care, right?
Yes.
Love to hear Stella or Suilan about this question.
Okay. Yeah, for this, wow, I mean, that was so powerful. I want to thank you for that. I kind of got lost in it, like, you know, just thinking about, wow, yeah, that's exactly how we should view how we enter the space, right? But I think too, one of the things that I'm going to go back to this because it was new for me, and just recognizing that this is what should be happening, right? Is our community, our Asian communities that are out there that are, you know, thriving on the resources and systems that are, you know, that they're able to thrive in, is, you know, reach back. You know, if you're API, have you identified a PI group, right? To teach them these ways so that they may be resilient, that they may thrive and be healthy just as much. Because that's one of the things that I can say my experience, not like I knew it, but it was different experiencing it, you know, coming in from being the funder, and just having that opportunity to go, listen, it's okay. I'll guide you through this. You know, well, this is doing this work. It'll be fine because I'm here to guide you. I'm here to help you to be successful. Like, let's not be afraid to go into this, you know, this new space with government and, you know, because of what is required from that. You know, I tell them all the time, it's okay to go into it. It's just, don't be afraid to ask, especially when there's someone there to help you, such as myself. And again, that says that I'm speaking very, very, very granular right now to just being what I'm experiencing and saying, this is what needs to happen, you know, is those Asian communities that are thriving, that they too are not only standing up the Pacific Islanders, but they're also, as Tavai had pointed out, the Southeast Asians, the ones that are also left behind and that looks very much like ourselves, So I believe that, if we could utilize that, what they call the technical assistance of things, right? If that could occur, I believe that, we'll find this liberation more often than not because of the fact that, they're actively taking steps to support our success.
Yeah. That makes me actually think about my experience when I was working at a PACE, and we had one of the funders support with funding to create a partnership with Utopia at the time. And I was able to really kind of skill transfer everything I learned in civic engagement to Tweety, actually. And it was a beautiful example in solidarity and equity. And I would love to see more of those collaborations that are also funded and accessible.
Yeah. And to add on to that effect, I think there is beauty in allyship between, the difference in our respective communities, especially when we come together to share resources, to share wealth, to share knowledge even. The difficulty of it is that we know that we shouldn't have to sort of like you use like sort of a buddy system to get where we need to get to, which is why I find it very difficult as far as like holding others accountable to what they say, when they say, and the way that they mean it, as far as showing up for communities of color, specifically relates to like policymakers. And I'm curious, like how in obtaining liberation for all of our communities, what is a way as like from an organizer's lens that we can use as a method to sort of ensure that accountability is met when holding people true to what their promises are to us. Sorry, I just want to open that up for anyone to sort of chime in on if you have that sort of experience to share.
I think, I just want to, and please, sisters, anytime you want to jump in, just jump in. But, there are individuals who hold positions, who hold, they have a positionality, right? In a specific organization that can assist in moving in a direction that is supportive of the communities that we're talking about, our communities that we're talking about. And, we hear about positionality, but how are they utilizing that positionality, to benefit not just their own communities, but the surrounding communities that they share a kaiaulu with, right? The community with, that we share our environment with, that we share our resources with. And how are they utilizing that in order to make not just their vahipana, their little bit of their place, healthy and well, but their overall border communities well with them. So again, how are we lifting each other up, and how are we liberating and not being in competition with each other? And I think too many times, again, we go back to a system that was built for competition and hierarchies, right? And we cannot continue to emulate that as we begin to be pono, right? As Tavai said, if you're going to be pono doesn't mean that you're in competition for funding. You're in competition for the highest numbers. What you need to do is you need to be looking at what is the need of this particular community, and then finding those resources to serve that need. And if you don't need that in your community, then don't take it.
Thank you.
Right? Don't take it.
I'm sorry.
And that's what's happening, right? They don't need it, but they're taking it anyway because they don't want you to have it.
Exactly.
So, calling that out and being like, why did you take that? When you know your community is already well stocked, and you can feed yourself for a good year, and this community is sitting here starving, why would you take that? And if you do take it because it's within your scope, then you gift it to the community in need.
Yes.
You gift that back to the community.
I'm going to do this in partnership with. I'm going to do this to support this. Like that's it. Call it out. Say it. Do what you're gonna do, but don't. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Don't take it all.
You can't. Like why do you need that? Like okay, we all had those aunties and uncles and even family members that hoarded them bags of rice, but the rice went rotten, right? We don't need to be hoarding. We need to be sharing. And I think that's something, that we need to be, again, we're not in competition. We need to be pono. If we have the capability of just so happen our Vahipana, our collective can get these resources, we know we don't need them, then we distribute that out to the surrounding communities that are in need of that. And one thing I want to say, because we talked earlier about, possibly some policy and state agencies being here, Washington right now has one of the fastest growing Pacific Islander community moving here because of the disparities and the environmental impacts and the environmental injustices and the economic injustices, and the land displacements, because we can't afford to stay home right anymore, and we have to talk about that. So for those who are in those spaces, to how are we helping for that to be made aware? Who's tracking that data? I'm tracking that data in my own way, right? And I can tell you how many Pacifica families are coming into our school districts on the wide, right? And what services are being provided for those families that are coming over with the needs that they have. And the last thing I want to say about that too, because this does goes back to resources and policies and how they're not. We don't have them in place right now because, the data, the disaggregation of the data or the aggregated data, right, is our languages. Our indigenous languages are not being used as biliteral seals, right? We can have dual languages and they're taking French and they're still taking Spanish in schools, but they're not taking Hawaiian. They're not taking Samoan. They're not even taking Lushootseed, which is the native language of this land. And it's kind of like when in Hawaii finally got Hawaiian as the language of, the official language of the state. It was like, oh, okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. We're in Hawaii. It should be the official language of the state, right? But what are we doing to make sure that our students are being valued for the dual languages, the assets that they have, and that they can be utilized in ways to showcase the cultural wealth of knowledge and that they come with? But I'm not going to go too off on that language, because that's a restorative thing too, right? But really, I want to just go back to how are we using positionalities in state agencies, policies, legislative places, and even in our own, to say how are we sharing these resources and we're not emulating what we know we're disrupting.
Yes.
I mean, if I can add and build on your point, I think some of it really also harkens back to when you talk about this canoe metaphor, right? Like, I need more Pacific Islander organizations, so I only have to do my role in the canoe. If I gotta paddle the whole canoe by myself, we're not going anywhere.
Nope.
We're not going anywhere. And being really clear with folks that abundant framework is also so you can play your part and only your part. So you can sustain yourself, right? Because a lot of those structures also don't set yourselves up for sustainability. And part of it, even thinking about COVID, EPIC as an organization was designed to be a builder and a weaver. We were designed to set systems up and weave folks together and convene folks. COVID demanded that we become like rapid responders and healers. That's not it's not our lane. Right. And so we're trying to move out of it. And that required standing up other folks who are actually good at that, who are actually that is exactly what they were designed for. That frontline responder, that's a fa lave lave if I've ever seen one. Right. For our Samoan people of who isn't ready at a moment's notice to mobilize around that. Right. This is our 2-year fa lave lave that is COVID-19 for our communities, that is this pandemic. But all that to say that the other component is that we often get approached by philanthropy, by state agencies who say, we want to fund your community, but nobody else is big enough. I was like, well, how are they supposed to get big enough if you don't fund them? Like, so we don't take resources unless we have permission. We're like, all right, we're going to do this, but we're going to go ask them first. And you will not be the one to tell us. You don't give us permission. Our people do. And then how are we setting them up that eventually they can do it themselves, that they broker their own relationships, that we're not doing gatekeeping, that they don't have to rely on us to make those connections, to seed those spaces, and so that everybody is also, so that technical assistance component, right? Like, I need a stronger ecosystem altogether so that I can better play my part. And I think that's that notion of like biomimicry is very cultural in the Pacific. We always knew we had to learn from our environments, and our environments say that the most competitive animals are actually endangered species. Like, our environments say it's actually the most collaborative species that continue to exist for generations and generations. And so how do we use those lessons too? And I think to your point as well, Suilan, like, that is also why language is so important, because language tells us those things. And it's not a coincidence that our languages are the first things that they banned, because they just didn't want us to know all of that, right? And so all this is like, it's just bringing up a lot, and I've got a lot of things that I'm thinking about. But I appreciate you asking the question and even thinking about this component of like, what is the responsibility? How do we hold folks accountable, and the organizing component? Because I think the thing that you do especially well, Tweety, is building political will, right? That policy occurs in a problem, solution, and political will, where our communities are the experts on naming and assessing the problem, that we're also going to be the experts on proposing the most effective solutions, the ones that are actually going to work, and that the organizing is actually where you build the political will for those policy changes to happen.
Thank you for speaking on that and for bringing that up too. It really, the conversation now is really getting deep and is really bringing up a lot of emotions in me as I'm like thinking back on many instances where the shift in power, the balance of things sort of hang in the distance as far as like where our communities stand. So I'm just all the more inspired to continue to carry out this work going forward, and with a newfound sense of appreciation for everything that's already been going on. But to engage in this conversation with each and every one of you is really like, it's just an honor. So thank you for saying that.
Yeah, I want to speak a little bit on how the lived experience of Utopia staff really showed up when we passed Senate Bill 5315. It was getting elective surgery, cosmetic surgery to be, which was gender affirming surgery to be covered under
5313, Senate Bill 5313.
To have gender affirming surgery covered under employer insurance. And we really kind of like highlighting the assets of our community members who came from the trans community, and really having them like center stage, talking to legislators, advocating, testifying. I felt like it really helped sway the opinions and really kind of, I mean, just hearing directly from the faces was really quite powerful, and something we need to do. We really need to show up for.
Yeah, not to flex or anything, but that really was a true testament or example of
flex. Go ahead and flex.
Yeah.
Will, as you say, Tavai, on the trans community, specifically the Fa'afafine, the Vakasale Veleva, the Mahu community here all throughout Washington State. There needs to be more activism from our communities to legislation that once again creates an environment where our lives can be more meaningful here as we continue to take up resources from the first people of this land. We want to be able to credit that back to them in a way that is cohesive enough for all of us to be in harmonious existence with each and every one of each other.
Yeah, and I think you just spoke in regards to how we show up, and so and I'll speak on the policy. Again, I don't like the word mastery, but we'll pick and choose on what we have. But MBL, which is mastery based learning, which I think is Senate Bill 5249. And we were utilized in 2018. I wrote a proposal alongside of our community members, our Pacifica community members, our Native Indigenous Coast Salish communities, and really in relationship with the Muckleshoot community on how we are underutilizing the value of cultural and wealth and the intelligence that our community already comes with, right? And how it's not used for graduation requirement credits, and our students are not getting credit for the things that they are doing in community, which we know that anybody can get a, you can get a pala, a paper, but are you a contributing community member, right? When you after you leave with that pala with that degree. And so, then, we were part of the report in 2020, and then that went into the House and it went into the Senate and it passed. And so now, because of that funding, here we go with the money, right? Funding went into that. Now 18 school districts have funding where they can utilize mastery-based learning for their students, but it was based off of our own indigenous ways of knowing and being. And so, for example, when our students would do the Samoan Arts Festival, they were learning language, they were learning culture, they were learning history. And when our Native students are on canoe journey, they're learning culture, they're learning history. It's STEM. It's all the way across the board. They're learning language. But we were discounting that knowledge because that knowledge was not the knowledge that was valued in our educational system, right? We know that, the educational system was built off of white supremacy. And so utilizing this and putting ourselves into those spaces and being in relationship with the people of this area, this Whakipana, allowed for this policy to now pass. Now, because of that, 18 school districts have startup funds of $40,000 apiece, going into a 2-year funding for $142,000 for 2 years. So students can begin to utilize cultural experiences and bring that into their own education. Because isn't the goal to really cultivate youth who are who have passion and desire for what they're doing, and then contribute back to the communities? And so, and that, like the bill that you folks backed on and the one that we did. And I think we have to pay attention to what bills are landing. And then as community members, right, we have to rally within that and even have people supporting that and getting out to the communities and saying, this is why this is so important. Who's your congressperson and who's going to help to push this through, and who's your senator that's going to help to sign off on those bills.
But it's going back to, do they even know that? That's not a structure that we grew up with, right? So to, think about, again, going back to educating the community and ensuring that they trust and believe that these are good things that will happen for them. Because that's another part to these systems, is they can't trust it because it was never for them.
Right. That's a really good point that you bring up too, which sort of takes me back to what Savai had mentioned earlier about when you're going to call people out on their accountability and then they sort of react with that, oh, I didn't know sort of response. I guess I'm curious to sort of like, my curiosity lies to find out like who's actually responsible for doing their due diligence to make sure that those people know exactly what's going on. Like, is it my responsibility to keep doing the storytelling, to keep trying to collect the data and showcase it to you in a way that's not that you're not understanding or hearing us on, or should it be like you, someone who is already in a position of power, to know that, or to sort of keep up with what's going on, with communities that are being impacted. I think that further creates like a divide in a lot of the work that we do, especially when we try to hold folks accountable for things that that continue to happen.
I think, yeah, I just want to just say something to that is, we have political agendas, right? When we look at what are the political agendas for some of those who are out there saying that, and they'll come to our communities, they want our votes, and they're solicit to our communities for our votes, but are they addressing the needs of our communities? And I think we have to hold them accountable for that. If you are going to come into our communities and you're going to ask for our support and for us to be out there supporting you in your endeavor to achieve, especially if you're not from our communities. And I'm just going to say that we can, allies are great, but that authenticness needs to be questioned. If the moves that they're making aren't on the behalf of creating healthier communities for those that they're serving. And sometimes that's exactly what it is, right? We have to be able to. I'm a dissector, like I said earlier, and my eyes are always on those things that are going on and trying the best, but it isn't my responsibility either, right? That weight, and I think Tavai touched on that. Like, we have to have, our va'as are six seats, yeah. Suilan can't be the only one paddling that. We gotta have more members in those seats so that we can flow as one unit, and that we know that we're getting somewhere, because otherwise we just paddling, but we're not going anywhere. But we have to hold those accountable who may not be from our communities, but want our community's support, and ask them, okay, so this is what we need. How are you going to help to service that as well? I think it's a shared responsibility.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I think we touched a little bit on this next question. I would love to hear if folks have any more concrete examples, but while we acknowledge the great importance of disaggregation of the work in our movements, we also can't overlook the importance of cross-racial solidarity, intersectional community organizing. So I'm curious to hear examples of how genuine cross-racial or intersectional solidarity showed up in your work or in your personal life.
I'll come in on that one really, not really quick, because I don't think we ever really quick, but I work in a deep relationship with our Muckleshoot tribe, and those of you who know me know that I come from a canoe family from home. I am a paddler, so when we use the canoe metaphors, I come from a huiva'a, right? So I am from a canoe family. And when I came here to Washington almost 11 years ago, it was only natural for me to get to know this Vahipana, this land, these waters, and the canoe families here. And so I'm Hanai from the Muckleshoot canoe family, which means taken in, right? Because, and I do journey with them, and I paddle with them, and we share our communities' resilience and even some of our struggles together. So I think that's really important. But and on another level, we also partner with ECLC, which is Educators of Color, through PSESD, which is our Education Service District here. And building into that community. And then Utopia, you folks are in our schools. You're supporting, our young transgender and our LGBTQ plus students, and we bring you into their, Mane comes in every Wednesday and Thursday, and they look so forward for Mane coming in. Helped one of our seniors get ready for a senior photo op, and so really, I think it's all about those relationships. And then how do we, again, going back to some of us might have more resources, but how do I have an overstock of poi, right? I'm just going to use random poi as an example, right? But I'm gonna share my poi with you because I don't need that much. So, being in relationship that way, and then working with state agencies so that they can see what that looks like as they begin to create funding and support for our students. And so right now, I'll go back really quick to that mastery-based learning because of the relationship with the Muckleshoot tribe and the ECLC from Puget Sound Education Service District, and the relationship I have with some people on the Washington State Board of Education. We were able to get this through, so now all of our students can benefit from that. And so I think it really is about utilizing those positionalities and those partnerships and sharing those resources.
Yes. Love that, Suilan. Tavai or Stella, could you share examples of how you've experienced, genuine, authentic, intersectional solidarity in your work or life?
Yeah, I'll go. I mean, it's, I grew up in with schools and neighborhood that's really diverse. So just learning, just having that, being able to learn from one another and understand that we are more similar than not in many ways, and just connecting in that way just is like a comfort level that allowed my perspective on folks in general, to be less biased, just again going to that comfort, like when we call each other family, you really feel that, it's authentic because you understand one another better, and studies even show that schools that have that cross-racial or intersectionality, it doesn't matter whichever way that folks are calling it, but they show that the students do better. It's like you said about that MBL, it's like they're doing better because of it, so that's my experience, and just kind of looking at it from what we're seeing now in more diverse schools. So
Absolutely. Tavai?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really clear. So I think the first thing that came to mind is yesterday, the administration of Native Americans put on a webinar on Samoan language vitality. I was like, wait, the administration of Native Americans for their AANHPI Heritage Month celebration presented the programming that folks like Lefetuau and Sa'ili are doing in Utah and Hawaii, and even the Samoan language preservation or revitalization programs in American Samoa, I think at American Samoa Community College. It was so beautiful, and just like there's so many folks who are just crying throughout the program, and I was like, to see our Native siblings saying like, we're gonna make space for you, and we also know what it means to need to revitalize your language, right? To make sure that, and I think that a lot of folks were probably surprised to see that even American Samoa, like our own homelands, are at a point of language revitalization, right? And knowing that language loss in the Samoan community happens in one generation.
Yeah.
It happens pretty quickly for us. And so I think that was a beautiful moment to witness, and even most recently. And I'm also very clear that everything that I'm able to do now only happened because there was cross-racial solidarity, right? And even all of our work is inherently intersectional. And even all the credit and praise to Kimberly Crenshaw for giving us that language to name the multiple ways in which you can be like oppressed, and in particular under the guise of policy and law. I think that other point, right? Like I'm, in sitting in a space and always with working with Utopia, there's like a conversation where Alicia from Utopia Portland was interviewing Dr. Jamaica Osorio. That was this question about visioning for the future. And Jamaica said really poignantly and beautifully, like, I'm following the cutie pie. Like, I'm following the cutie pox. I am following the queer and trans people of color who have always had to build a different world, right? Who've always had to create places because the one we have now is built on it was designed to kill them, right? And so I think that is that sort of intersectional like frame, and knowing that like who is best equipped to actually build the worlds that we need, and who has actually the most practice around that world building, right? As so many forget, right? Like even thinking around the pandemic and the harm reduction, mutual aid, all of these things are things that come from queer and trans sex workers, and needing to name that genealogy very clearly for folks, that the most effective tools that we've utilized, particularly at EPIC during this pandemic, have come from folks who our communities have historically rejected and ostracized, and needing to be very clear with folks like, my best lessons come from the people, my survival is rooted with the folks who have been having to practice survival for generations, for a really long time since we were colonized.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly like that. A lot of what you all said resonated so much. Specifically speaking, as a person or representation of Utopia from a community of mostly comprised of trans women who lead this work and sort of set new standards and examples for folks to sort of follow. But it's through that continued trust and solidarity with one another. But one thing that I want to mention too, it's like consistency in showing up for each other plays a very big part of that solidarity piece. You know, I can think on multiple examples, um, you know, in which we've had to show up for each other, like, and it shouldn't have to take something tragic like a falablave or a disaster that's devastating our homelands, for us to come together to show up and share solidarity with one another. It should be also shared in spaces that are positive and enlightened. So, like specifically with the luau that we put on, where we collaborated very closely with the Muckleshoot tribes to be able to pull our resources together to celebrate our communities, celebrate the beauty in our different cultures, which is, I think that's a great example on, you know, cross-racial solidarity with each other. And so, yeah, I just hope that all of that continues to go on as we move through this work.
Thanks for doing that, Julie. I think, yeah, how do we celebrate the moments of joy and really, build a movement that's based on joy and showing up for each other. I'd love to kind of maybe think about the next steps, so to say, in terms of how do we look forward in the future, as we look at the end of our Talanoa. So according to the U.S. Census Bureau, by 2030, the U.S. NHPI population is expected to be over 2 million. So my final question for the panelists is, what's next after disaggregation? When we imagine Pacifica having their own disaggregated resources, what then? What should we look for?
Maybe we can start with Stella.
Yeah, sure. I think it's taking the example of what Suilan has done with the MBL, just really, building that out, taking that to the very top, and then making sure that it's utilized, that it benefits all. You know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, just I wasn't aware of that, and to know that, we're bringing like culture back into there that, is relevant to in a learning environment, to be, well aware and healthy, like these are all things that allow our youth to grow. And I guess it's when we talk about breaking generational curse, like that's what that would look like. We're breaking and I don't want to say it's a curse, but I want to say that it definitely will build on generational wealth, and when I say wealth, I'm not talking about just money, I'm talking about justice. And so, and I'm talking about inclusive opportunities. I mean, it's just all of the things that we say in so many different ways, because we're trying to ensure that folks hear us, they understand that we know what we're talking about. And so we're telling you in so many different ways. But the truth at the end of the day is that's what it looks like. It's legacies. It's our generation being able to continue without being, silenced, washed out, so just that's the way I'm seeing it. So, or envisioning what the future would look like, after disaggregating this data. So when you look at those big, beautiful white buildings they built long, long ago, like those nice, beautiful courthouses, hopefully we'll have big, beautiful buildings like that serves, our needs as well. So
Thank you for sharing. Tavai, Suilan, any thoughts?
Mahalo Tavai. And I'm gonna build on Sister Stella, where we continue to build on those relationships, and we're able to strengthen the work that we're all doing collectively, right, with our community partners. And especially as we continue to talk about our Muckleshoot relatives right now, who is a really wonderful example of a community that was historically marginalized, oppressed, down to one chimney stack of less than an acre that was put on a reservation and renamed because of the colonization that they experienced. And now they've built this resilient community, this nation, through treaties that they had to relearn, because for hundreds of years it held them in oppression. But once they relearned that language, they were able to regain their people's wealth through the salmon. So we're environmentally responsible to that. As a relative, that's a salmon, is their relative here. But they didn't just feed their own village, right? They're the second largest employer of King County. And they continue to give back to the community. So if we really want to look at an example of what it is to come out of the oppression of white supremacy, colonization, stolen land, and be able to return not just to our own people, but the people who we share our vahipana with, then we can use that as an example. And we look at the keikis, right? The kikiokaina, and we know that that's our future. As Stella said, our legacies, our mo'olelos. How do we continue to build on that, right? We do that in solidarity. We understand this land that we are on right here, right now in Washington. We become stewards with the Aboriginal people who are the genealogy holders of this place, and we understand our position within that, and we help to build that future for all of our communities. And again, they are an amazing relative to share this journey with, and an example of what it looks like to give back when you have received your blessings again.
Wow.
yes.
Yeah, it's so amazing to hear you share the wisdom that you've been able to learn by cultivating this relationship with this community. And yeah, I appreciate you. I appreciate you, Suilan. Thank you for that. Thank you.
Tavai, would you like to add on?
I mean, Lavania heard future, and she's like, "Oh, that's me!" Like you're talking about.
Yes. That's your picture. That's right.
Yeah. She also wanted you to see her Moana outfit and her hair that she just braided. No, I think thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's always so healing. I appreciate I just appreciate being able to listen to people and have it feel like medicine. I think that's a gift. This 2030 census estimate, I don't what does 2 million mean in an ocean of people? I think that sort of measurement, it means something to the census, right? Because they are built in scarcity, and they're like, you're 2 million people, so you should have 2 million people worth of resources, or whatever the case, right? I don't know that matters to us. The reality is there's already more of us here than there are in our homelands. There's more Samoans here than there are in our homelands. There's more Kanaka, as Suilan said, because we've been pushed out. We've been, we can't even afford to stay home. So I think these measurements and these numbers, I think folks assume that it'll translate to political power. And if it's not 2 million Pacific Islanders moving together towards liberation, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
If it's not 2 million Pacific Islanders who are pro-Indigenous, who are pro-Black, who are pro-LGBT, then it won't actually get us anywhere. So how can we be unified towards that? And I think to Stella's, or not so, Suilan's point at the beginning was like, our back is to the future. We don't actually think in these linear ways, right? That Pacifica notions of time are a spiral. The future is already here and it's happening, which I think the most beautiful part of that is that it's inevitable. What has come to pass has already been prophesied by our cosmologies, by our ancestors, by our gods and goddesses, and by whatever akua that you give your thanks to. They've already decided that our freedom is inevitable. Right? I think that's the beautiful thing. So if there's anything that's to be next, it's land back. What's next is whatever Lavania said it is.
Yeah.
That my responsibility as an anti-vi, and I've been really clear with folks too. I say anti-vi is my most important title, not just because I have 5 nieces and nephews, because auntie is this like relational respect title that we give to folks. And so it's also something I take on as a responsibility to be the radical elder I needed when I was a young person, when I was a youth. And so what's next is that I clear the path, that I create some ease. And that other point of like, this notion of paying your dues or whatever the case, I will only feel I have accomplished things if it's easier for the generations who come after me. If I have relieved them of any undue suffering, if they get to liberation faster because of something that I did. And so if that's like, if we're going to think about the future in this context of an inevitable liberation and also a responsibility to clear the path, then I think that's what I'm most hopeful about.
I love that. And, I just want to, there's that quote by Maya Angelou, right, that says, take up the battle, right? Under ordinary circumstances, I'll be long gone. But what have I left to make sure that I've lessened the work that needs to be done?
Yeah.
And by just doing the right thing, and she says, just do the right thing, right? Kino ole. We talk about kino ole, right? And our laulima and doing this together. And then our kuleana, our responsibilities. And what does that look like? It looks like this right here. As we continue to Talanoa and talk story about what we're doing in order to bring our collectives together. Much mahalos to you all.
Much mahalos to you and alofa'anga and all of that. I feel a lot more liberated, a lot more woke, just sitting in conversation with you all. So thank you all for contributing your brilliance and your shared experiences, your lived experiences, most importantly, to this topic. Tavai, I wish I had an auntie like you, or I wish I could be your niece. There needs to be a lot more examples of each and every one of us here for the children. And I really wish that the children are taking a good observation at us in a way that they'll come up to take up the torch or what have you, so that there's more equity within our lives, specifically as we take up more resources here in the US or wherever it is that we choose to migrate to, forcibly or not. So yeah, I just want to, I think it's a good time to probably close us out. And with that, I'd like to maybe go around individually to ask if everyone could come up with one word to sort of, if you could share one word as to how this conversation or this Talanoa means or resonated with you. Siang, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. I think the one that's coming up for me is something that Suilan had mentioned about assets and how we come in with assets. And this conversation initially was about disaggregation, but I think about just the brilliance and the wisdom that our communities bring when we're seen as marginalized under white supremacy and imperialism and the empire. And so I really just want to highlight the assets that we bring in and the gifts that we bring in. That was way longer than one word. Sorry. So much gratitude.
We heard the one word.
I'll pass it to Suilan.
I'm just gonna say, I don't know if I have one word either, but our mo'olelo, right? Our legacies and our mo'olelo, again, our languages are not like English languages. They don't have they have kauna, they have hidden meanings, right? And there's so much in a mo'olelo, right? And so, what are we doing to leave a mo'olelo, our own historical footprint, if you would, in the relationships that we're building for our future, but bringing in our past with us. And so we continue to do that and honor our ancestors who have paved and sacrificed so much for us to even be in this Talanoa. So I think I'm going to put it in there, and that way we bring all of our ancestors and our future and this present moment together as we continue to be on this huaka'i, this journey together. That's not one word either, okay? But you asking Pacificas for one word? No.
Who would you like to pass it to, Suilan?
I go pass it to Sister Stella.
All right, thank you. I think, just listening to everyone, I will say my one word is collective. Just really thinking about anything and everything we do as a collective. I know that there's many of us that may be disconnected to our communities. I mean, I know I have been, in and out because of life and everything, but coming together as a collective, like having this conversation, like we definitely need more Talanoas. We definitely need to empower our folks. So yeah, I guess I don't have one word either. So collective, being a collective, empowering one another. But it's all important so that we could continue, what we need for our folks, so, and Tawai, I'll let you close us out. Well, with the one word.
Tweety's gonna close us out. Yeah.
No, I'm saying with the one word.
With one word. I was like, oh shit! I see how we're talking. All the words came. I think the one word for me right now is local. Like the Samoan word for both prayer and church, and so much of this conversation felt like prayer. And there's a lot of ways that my dad's is a Faifeau, so I'm a PK. But my dad growing up taught me that like the structure of a prayer, you name all the names, you give gratitude, you ask for forgiveness, and you ask for what you need. And I think there was so much of this that we got to do all of that. And what I'll say is that I if there's anything that I said or I did or a way that I behaved that was harmful to anyone, I ask for your forgiveness and I apologize and just express the deepest gratitude for this. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Tawai. For me, I think my one word is solidarity. That's been a recurring theme in my head throughout this whole discussion. Just to recap on what I mentioned earlier, I feel like there needs to be more solidarity with each other, for each other, and not the type of solidarity that you would expect to have when you are trying to tokenize one community over the other, especially when it's pitting one community group over the other to acquire resources. But true intentionality, true care, true love for each other and each other's well-being is my definition of what solidarity looks like. And so, yeah, I think that's a good way to end us out. Once again, I just want to thank each and every one of you for your time this evening. I know maybe 2 hours wasn't enough to cover some topics, but definitely a lot more Talanoas, like Sister Stella had mentioned, is what's needed to ensure that everyone is more engaged and actively participating in acquiring equity for all of our communities. So thank you all so much.
Thank you all for joining us.
Thank
A round of
you.
applause for our panelists.
Yes.
Thank
And
you. Thank you for having us.
Evening, a safe evening,
Mahalo.
and we will keep in touch. If there's anything that we could do to provide support around your work and your needs, please feel free to reach out to us if anything.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Mahalo, everyone.
Good night.
Okay.
It says backstage.
Okay, good. Okay, we're on.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Just before we cut out, we wanted to share some organizational updates, some programmatic updates for folks who are interested in getting involved with Utopia Washington and the work that we do. Tomorrow evening from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m., Utopia Washington is holding an open house event. We want to invite each and every one of you to come in, enjoy our space, fellowship with not only our staff, but our community, get to know our partners, and really build relationships with each other. We are now located over on 841 Central Avenue North, Suite C106 here in downtown Kent. And we welcome you all to come in and take a look at our fabulously new space as we have recently expanded, but due to COVID, we're not able to share this space with community. So please come out, join us, bring your children, bring your elders. We'll have food, we'll have good music, and yes, let's fellowship.
And then our Maketi or community pantry, along with our DoorDash delivery project, is set to reopen for community on Tuesday, May 31st, during our usual office hours. For families or individuals who wish to have supplies delivered to you, you must fill out a support request form available on our website or social media platforms. For more information about our food services, please contact our community care coordinator, Tony Tupufia.
And another update, COVID-19 cases are still on the rise in our communities. We would like to urge everyone to utilize safe practices by washing your hands, wearing a mask when recommended, and getting tested, especially when symptoms are present. We also, if you're sick, stay home. Getting vaccinated and staying up to date with booster shots is the best way to protect yourself and our loved ones. And so if you're interested in receiving COVID-19 self-test kits that you can take at home, PPE supplies, face masks, sanitizers, COVID-19 vaccines, and even booster shots, feel free to contact Sasha Samuelu, who is our care coordinator from our FUFO team. She can work together with you to make sure that you have all of the supplies that you'll need to remain safe and stay safe. Lastly, we want to express our gratitude and our thanks to our friends at APACE for your continued support in this work. But most importantly, those of you tuning in with us this evening. Without you, this work would not be possible. And with that being said, we want to encourage you all to be safe and stay well. And we wish you all a fabulous evening. And thank you very much for tuning in.
Thank you. 감사합니다.